so the first interpretation out of the chute I'm going to give to you, we'll talk about a literal historical is meaning you're just taking it for what it says. You're not doing any of this reading between the lines or allegorizing. But in the gap theory, these two Hebrew words, tohu wabohu, or formless and void, imply or infer divine wrath or judgment. And so the idea these people have is, in Genesis 1:1, God makes everything, something happens, and when we, in between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, and so when we come on the scene in Genesis 1:2, the world is desolate. And all we have is like a planet covered in water. And the idea is maybe God destroyed the world through judgment with water, like this pre-Adamic world, this world before we even have the creation account being given to us. God already had a world. And what's nice about this theory, it allows you to wed a lot of modern scientific views and still take a literal, historical, grammatical reading of Genesis. See, I'm not allegorizing, I'm not saying it's a metaphor or a simile, I'm simply saying there is a gap, an indeterminate amount of time between when God made everything and then when we have the world described that we live in today. And many, many evangelical Christians, I would say probably the majority, hold to this sort of view. They may or may not believe in evolution. They may still believe God created everything directly. So this is a hermeneutical argument. It's not based on the world or science or anything else. It's just looking at the scripture, looking at the words, and trying to understand why would God use those two words together? Is he implying judgment? Let's talk about some of the pros and cons. I mean, that's really all there is to this theory. That's it. But let's talk about some of the strengths or weaknesses, pros and cons of the gap theory. So work with me as a group on this. We're going to do this with all the different interpretations I give you. So what's some of the strengths of the gap theory? I gave you the first one. Now maybe you don't care. Maybe you're just like, I don't care what science says, I'm just going with the Bible. But for some of you that want to look educated and not like some culty person or some medievalist, it's important for you to not just look crazy when you're talking to people. But not only is it death before sin, if you watch any of the Discovery Channel or anything, that prehistoric world, that walking with dinosaurs, it's pretty brutal, right? This isn't just some loving, utopic earth made by a benevolent deity. This is kind of like tooth and claw, eat or be eaten. It's a very rough and tumble world. What would be some other pros we have? You can, I want to say, you can still preserve scripture. And what I mean by that is, if you read it this way with the gap, even if Darwinian evolution or an old universe is true, it doesn't disprove the Bible. So you're allowed to have both. You can have science and God too, or science and Jesus too. And I guess that's kind of what that is. Science plus Jesus too. Other pros or cons. And the earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Love it. So basically we come on the scene in Genesis and we just have this earth covered in water. And that's it. But that's why I wanted you to be reading Genesis, because that would be my first trivia question. What day did God make water? It doesn't say, because the first act of creation, if you look at this as like a shopping list from here down, the first act of creation is light, but up here it would be everything, including water. So there is some value to this view that this is the totality of creation at once. It would help explain a lot, but then this starts to go into day one, light separated from the darkness. Fascinating. Let there be light. Separation of the water, not the creation of the water. So the water's there and God put some above sun below, and then we seem to have an in-between place as well. And see, this is where the Hebrews get this early idea. So we have this earth covered in water, but then the separation creates like a dome over the top of the earth. Almost like one of those glass cake domes, but it's a water dome. So we're actually surrounded in a dome of water, and then the sun, moon, and stars are actually floating around in this water. And just like you could like turn the top of a cake cover, that's how we're seeing the rotation of the sun, moons, and stars. It's literally like that dome's moving over this flat, stationary earth. And once again, if you've ever looked into like flat earth societies or usually they're Christians that are literal, historically, grammatical interpreters of the Bible. I mean, they make me look like an allegorical interpreter, because if it says the moon gives its own light, that's what the moon does. It doesn't matter what modern science says, right? But see, I would simply take that as a figure of speech, that yes, it's reflecting the sun's light, but that's not what the scripture says, if you take it literally. Is this making sense? Okay, so one of my big cons on this one, and this could just be my own issue, is I do not believe there were any gap theorists before 1859. I'm just going to put post 1859 theory. Anyone know what happened in 1859 that would relate to this? A book got published in 1859? Yeah, Darwin published Origin of Species. The full title of the book is Origin of Species and the Preservation of Preferred Races. Now, I always used to think, wow, could you get more racist in the title of a book? But by races, he meant like species of animals. He wasn't, now human races would be included in that, but he wasn't thinking primarily in human races in Origin of Species. But if you read Descent of Man, he's definitely talking about human species or races and why some are more evolved than others. Including women get thrown in that too, why women are less evolved or advanced than men. So really interesting book, and we'll talk about that in the latter part of the class, The Descent of Man. But Origin of Species, 1859, and this is why it bothers me. If we have the scriptures, going back, the book of Genesis written probably somewhere in the 2nd century BCE. I mean, that's amazing to think about. 1800 BCE. But no one notices a gap between Genesis 1 and Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 until after 1859. And why do they discover a gap? Because now they need time. Because there's not enough time for the world and all the plants and animals to evolve from a single-celled organism in 6,000 years. And I wrote the date up there. If you Google what year it is in the Orthodox Jewish calendar, this is the year 5780. And they are counting from the day of creation. And once again, that is the branch of Judaism that is taking the scripturals literal, historical, and they're interpreting it like you would see fundamentalist Christians interpret it. Same sort of thing. So speak of a young earth, right? That's like crazy young. We're not even at 6,000 years old yet. Any other comments, questions? It lets some people sleep at night. It lets people believe in science and the Bible too, and I don't begrudge people that. And quite frankly, I don't really even have that big an issue personally with the age of the Earth piece. If it's 4.5 billion years old, if it's under 6,000 years old, if it's 14 billion years old, that doesn't concern me as much. So, not to beat this to death, it's a latecomer. It's not even needed as an apologetic or a compromise until Darwinian theory comes out. Before then, Christians generally took either an allegorical or a literal reading of the scriptures. And so I think that's good for this one.